going? How's your full moon in Virgo treating you?
Really well. So we just did a fire ceremony, impromptu.
Nice.
We were actually just doing our spring cleaning and then it turned into a fire ceremony.
Fantastic. So spring cleaning turned into spring burning?
Oh, for sure. We were burning basically like the rotten wood all around our property. And not all of them is gone, but we figure like I was getting, okay, do another one in April. And so hopefully it's still going to be a little bit wet, especially with the fires last April. I mean, my goodness. So I'm like, cross my fingers. But what's showing up is just a lot of letting go of narratives that have been dominant in my life, but also narratives that have been protective, right? Of ideas and concepts that as a human being, it helps us cope with the immediate moment that we're in. So for example, I was just remembering a time when I was 2, and I don't remember it, but it was just a feeling when milk was no longer available to me. And so I think basically my mom probably stopped breastfeeding, and I was like, this is really funny. And milk represented something to do with like nourishment and safety and like all the things that Mother Nature kind of represents in a way. And I was like, wow, okay, so let's bring that back. Of just kind of bringing back the or allowing myself to not be protective of, oh, that's not going to be available to you, so you got to protect yourself, and creating layers that we don't need anymore. So that's just one example, but it's just like kind of coming in every day on a regular basis and just shedding these narratives and then allowing more abundance and love to come in. So yeah, that's my full moon in Virgo, since I'm also a Virgo.
So it's
How about you?
for you. Yeah, I love what you're saying, because in terms of just letting go of that like fear of not having the nourishment, like I can see where there's a hook there in scarcity versus the trusting that like source is going to provide the nourishment exactly when you need it.
Mm-hmm.
Does that kind of coincide to shifting into like greater levels of abundance consciousness?
I'm always like in the abundance consciousness, so it's more like the emotional connection. So not only like having that on a mental level, but also on the physical, emotional level. And for me, there is a difference between the physical energy, like I could feel energies, but also there's a difference between feeling energy in my body versus feeling the emotion, the echo of like what that energy actually is. And so when I allow myself to feel the emotion of whatever it is, because sometimes it's not mine, and I'm like, I really don't need to feel this. Well, oftentimes it's not mine, and I'm like, why am I feeling this? And so when it starts moving around my body, I'm like, oh Lord. But then when I name it and I can identify where it's coming from, then it just like goes away, because I'm like, yo, you don't need to be in my body, get the heck out. But the emotional part, where it's a narrative that I have, and that is, my attachment to the narrative, that kind of like goes away, and then because it goes away, it also, the barriers and it's almost like the echoes of that energy, of that narrative, also sort of like slough off. And so therefore I'm more open to seeing things and experiencing things in a way that carries a greater amount of compassion and love, if that makes sense. So
I love that.
yeah.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And I love your like that sort of granular differentiation between the energy and the emotion,
Mm-hmm.
and just what happens when we liberate ourselves from those kind of old emotional traumas, narratives, like whatever they are.
Right. Yeah. And there's so much going on right now that, like, I mean, everyone, on this earth, if you're on this earth in this moment, we're being exposed to so much light and so much energy that it's just like the only thing you can do is really let go. And if you choose to kind of carry all that stuff with you into the future, well, it's going to feel a lot heavier than before. So you're going to notice it more. And because everybody's kind of like sloughing it all off, sometimes you just need a purification. So, you know, the other day we got snow, right? And I was like, score. and whenever there's rain or snow, like it's such a blessing. And it just kind of washes all the like the stank energy in a way, you know, and just blesses the earth. And then like we're all blessed with like the new energy that's now in the earth and kind of percolating, and I can't wait till spring, you know. I mean, it already started feeling like spring here, but yeah.
It's so exciting. And it's rare that I have a guest on the podcast that we live in the same city. So I love that we're both,
Right.
yeah, it's just yesterday and Saturday, I'm like, is it spring? Is this insanely cold winter actually letting up a little bit?
Mhm. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm having for me, this is a very interesting Virgo full moon. I'm very
Mhm.
attuned to my relationship with the 30th gene key. And I know we had talked about the gene keys a little bit, and how that shadow of desire, how I have been in relationship with that in the past. And what I noticed is that, you know, in that system for me, that key lies in my core wound, right? So I can, you know, tracking through that system, I'm like, oh yeah, that is the through line for when I have historically lost my shit, when I don't get what I want, when my desires aren't being met. And noticing, oh, I have been in the habit of problemizing when my desires aren't met, and realizing I don't have to do that. I could just sit like a grown up and be like, look, my desire isn't being met and nothing has to be wrong and no one has to be to blame and I don't have to throw a tantrum and there don't have to be any problems,
Uh-huh.
which easier said than done. But I'm
Right.
like, you know, because it's so much sensation in my body. That's what I realize is, for me, desire is so physical, and the largesse of that energy has in the past thrown me off. So what I'm realizing is really helpful is to write a new story about what's coming instead, you know, trusting the universe, like, okay, this is actually perfect that I'm not getting this thing. Here's the sensation of what I do want, and I'm trusting that it's coming from some other realm. And then keeping that, you know, that bratty part of me that isn't getting what she wants really close, and being like, yeah, I see you. I get that you're not getting your way and you're totally fine. You can handle it. You have tools.
Uh-huh.
So it's a
Oh,
lot of like
nice.
multitasking right now.
Right. Right.
Internally.
Wow.
Yeah.
Is there a like a theme that's kind of coming up for you? And not just in like the last couple of days, but like just in general.
I think the theme is, I can really have what I want. And am I willing to be patient and trust and receive and not compromise in the interim?
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
what themes are coming up for you?
Mm-hmm. Uh, for me, there's so many things that happen every day. I guess the entire time that I feel like I've been in Santa Fe, the theme has been to learn to know when to rest, and then learn to like just to recognize when I'm in that go energy, to ride it. But then when it stops, it's like, that's okay, and don't go beyond that, you know. And the fire medicine has really taught me in a hilarious kind of way how I function, where I like the fire. So both my partner and I do fire ceremonies, and there are times when he starts a fire and there are times when I start a fire, and so we're the, you know, each one of us have the role of firekeeper. And my fires always start in the middle. It's like, it's not the foundational section, it's not like the core, it's in the middle. and
Like a
so
microwave.
yeah, or something. Like, I'm just like, seriously, you know, why doesn't the paper underneath light up properly? Right. And so I've learned to watch the fire and be like, okay, there are times when it'll just go and like it'll start firing up in the middle, and then I just need to close the flue, like the door to our little cubicle of a fireplace. and then let the air kind of like run through it and strengthen the whole process. So it's almost like I can light the fire, or like light an idea, just let it sit for a while. Universe will percolate the whole thing, and then I'll open the door and then add more wood, and as I add more wood, then because I get a little bit enthusiastic, some of those woods are a little bit too big. And so then I have to close it again and then let nature do its work. And then maybe like the second or third time, then the fire really takes on its own energy and it's, firing away. And then I could just put as many wood on top of it after that. Mm-hmm. But it's more, whereas like, my partner, he like sets it all up beautifully, and then like it's almost like a teepee shape, and then there's like paper or something like a kindling in the very middle with enough air to go through, and so he just lights that kindling and with one match, and then it's done. Like the whole thing starts growing, and like that's the way he is, right? He's an architect. He's very grounded and rooted in the built material. So I'm like, of course.
Yeah.
So,
but it's so funny because I was playing racquetball this morning with my friend who last time he came over, he was watching me try to build a fire, and he's like, do you actually know how to build a fire?
Oh no.
So there's no Virgo in my chart whatsoever. Like you would be appalled at what is happening in my fireplace. It just like throw a bunch of things in, a bunch of paper, light it on fire. Sometimes it catches, sometimes it doesn't. Like it's not really super methodical, but usually it works.
As long as you're having fun while you're doing it.
And it's such a great testament to like how we all have our own different ways of doing it. Like you and your partner have your different fires. So I'm super excited to have you on the show. I'm intrigued by your path because I know when I first met you at the Pechakucha, just so the audience knows, we both presented at the same Pechakucha event in Santa Fe. And I was just as surprised that you were participating as I was in participating, because I was thinking like, I'm going to be exposed as not like totally swallowing the liberal Kool-Aid and then booted out. And then you're coming at it with this like high mystical light languages where I was like, whoa, I didn't realize that like they were bringing in this cool, like mystical spiritual aspect. But then on top of that, you have such a like kind of fierce East Coast vibe about you, which is so rare in Santa Fe. Like I love it so much. And I know your background is like hardcore poli-sci, and you worked in Washington and you worked in the Obama White House, and now you're like channeling these light languages. So how did all of this happen?
That's like huge question. So is the question, how did all the light language start happening? Or
yeah, I'm really curious about your path of like where along the way of like, what seemed, and I could be wrong, but like a kind of left-brained, like more serious, like international politics career, and then getting pulled off into something that's even fringy for like woo-woo people.
Oh, right. Yeah. It's super fringy. Which I was a little surprised, but I was like, oh, I guess it is. Yeah, so I have always been really interested in just complexity in general, I think. I grew up in a family of 7 other children, so we were 8 kids. So you can imagine, as an elder sister taking care of younger children, and 2 parents who are working full-time in separate countries at certain points of our childhood, and just kind of navigating, where everything lies and how I can control my environment, right? So, and having that many siblings, like you do end up doing a lot of politicking inside the house, and because I was the elder 3, like, so I have 2 older sisters and then 5 younger siblings. And my sisters and I basically took care of the younger siblings at different parts of our lives throughout, since I was 6, I could remember. And so it just built in me. And both my sisters, this sense of responsibility and needing to know, like, what's going to happen next. Like, what do we need to prepare so that we don't have any problems or challenges along the way? And this carried into when we moved to the United States for the first time when I was 9. And again, navigating a completely different culture, a completely different school system, right? And navigation, I mean, everybody was driving cars, like you didn't have freedom to navigate on your own. Whereas in Japan, well, at least in Tokyo, you could go from anywhere to anywhere without a car, right? Public transportation exists. And so
what were some of the primary differences you noticed between the school systems as a 9-year-old? Like, what stood out for you as being so different?
Well, first of all, I came from a Catholic all-girls school in Tokyo to a co-ed private school in Virginia. And there wasn't much diversity. And because the Catholic school that I went to, a lot of the diplomats' kids went there. So like my best friends were from like Zambia and, Namibia, or like all these other different places like Pakistan. And so when I came to the United States, I was like, wow, wait, and so that was my first impression. The second impression was the food really did not taste good. So I stopped drinking milk altogether and then developed my own lactose intolerance. But before that, in Japan, like
milk theme.
Oh yeah, nurturing. So when I came to the US, the milk just tasted so horrible, and so I stopped drinking it. But just food in general, they were huge. Like, your eggplants are like, I don't know how many times the size of the eggplant in Japan. and yet our food in Japan are like, they're small, but they're like packed with flavor. And in the US, it's grown for just like the quantity and, the size and all that good stuff. And so that was a huge adjustment. And I think just needing to rely on people who have a driver's license was a real shocker. It really limited the amount of exposure that we had to the whole area. So we lived right outside of Washington, D.C., and I can't really tell you like what Washington, D.C. was like back then, because we were just in the suburbs most of the time. And my mom she's like, well, why would you want to go into the city? Like we always had to have a reason for everything. And so that was the difference. And then obviously, the cultural context, Americans are very upfront, and there's not much subtlety in the way that folks relate to one another. And, the cliques and all that kind of stuff that existed in our school as well in Japan. But because it was more diversified in the backgrounds that people were coming from, it didn't have such a polarized experience to it, if that makes sense. And then I just kind of got used to it. When you're 9, you just kind of absorb everything. Yeah. But because I was really interested in human interaction and how, like, why people do things the way, why are people the way they are, I gravitated toward political science and history while I was in high school. And then in college, I had the opportunity to either go into computer science and neuroscience or international relations. And I was kind of gunning for neuroscience for a while. And it was just when neuroscience became a major that you could actually choose, back in the day. And so this was right when the computer labs were like, the first computer labs were coming out in universities as well. So it was a really exciting time. And unfortunately, after my first year of college, I was like, all the younger siblings were pulled back to Japan. And so my parents were like, no, we're like, the younger kids and the children in general are losing the cultural context in which they grew up in or were born into. And they're becoming more too Americanized, like too detached from the family values. And so my parents brought all the kids back to Japan, and somebody needed to take care of them. So I was it. and I took 2 years off of college. And at the time I wanted to go back to university at the second year because I was like, oh my God, raising kids like all the time. And, it's super not my life. I did not want that to be my full-time job. And I was still working, but, I was like that, I really want to go back to the university and then at least get my diploma. So at the time, the only option was to do international security. And there was no neuroscience in the place that I was studying. So I did international security. It was fantastic. I had a former ambassador who was the lead professor, and he just brought so much experience and knowledge, like lived experience, into the curriculum that I think that was my inspiration for continuing on. And I ended up transferring to Barnard College, Columbia University, and finishing out my last 2 years. I probably could have, I could have graduated within a year, but they require you to have at least 2 years under your belt in order to get a diploma. Cash cow. Yeah. And so I just graduated as quickly as possible. And at the time, Columbia University did not have any international security classes. I was floored. I'm like, how is an institution like Columbia not have? I mean, they had SIPA, right? Or is it SIPA, the international school? But it's for the master's program. And I think at the time I wasn't really looking at like for those classes to be available to me. And so I was like, fine, political science, like I'll just graduate as fast as I can, and just like did all the requirements and got out of there. But if at the same time, it was like, as I was kind of going through my career path, I wanted to be a lawyer, but like my test taking skills, not so great. So my LSATs were like, no. And I was like, okay, whatever, my path is going to take a different turn. And as one thing led to another, I ended up gravitating toward things where I would organize a lot of activity around political, like elections, or training young people on how to use the political system, for their own community, or their whatever the issue was, from fifth grade onward. So fifth grade to like full adults and everything. And
so does that mean like civics, like local government?
Yeah, local government. So in the New England area.
I'm just curious because it seems like most people in this country don't have a clue about that. Do you think it was the fact that you came here from Japan that gave you some sort of leg up or different perspective to be able to hack that system in a way that seems like most of the people who are born here haven't grokked yet?
Yeah, I think for sure. I mean, coming from a different, like, even if you're coming from a different state into a different, like, take us, for example, right? We're coming from a different state to Santa Fe, New Mexico, and we see the local engagement in a completely different way, from a new set of eyes that has no history, like historical baggage or trauma, or, all that stuff. And so for sure, coming from Japan here, and looking at the political system, I'm like, there are so many advantages to it. And also, because your legal system, to the extent that you can navigate the legal system well, provides at least an in to pursue justice. And I think that's unique in the United States compared to all the other countries. Japan does not have the kind of system that the United States has. It's very male dominant, primarily from maybe the top 3 schools that are all the the jurors and everything. They're all from the top 3 schools over there. So it's not diversified at all. And it's very consensus based, which does not do well when you're talking about like justice, right?
Right.
Yeah.
I'm curious because you mentioned it's male dominated, and I know there's a lot of opinions as to how like the patriarchy is rearing its head in the States. Do you see women in justice, women having power in these systems?
In Japan?
In the States?
Oh, in the States. Not as much compared to the men in the system, but compared to other countries, for sure. Yeah. Yeah, you have much more leeway, and it's just a matter of how much you truly believe that you have that capacity, and and that you can grab it. I think, and I think that's the work that we're all doing, right? Not just in the United States, but like folks who haven't had traditionally hadn't had a voice, like all of that has been coming up, you know, particularly after COVID really hit. And but even before that, you know, the LGBTQ movements of the 70s, 60s, and 70s also like really led the way for a lot of voices to be heard and policies to change, you know. And here we are in a time when, you know, same-sex marriage is legal, you know, which in our lifetime was illegal.
Right.
so there's a lot of progression that has been achieved because of these people before us, you know, and also people before that time as well. And it's just kind of like layering upon each other. And I feel like right now we're going through this accelerated transformation where that change is happening much more rapidly, not only because of all the people before us who have demonstrated to us a path, but now we're getting into a point of there is a new path that we're carving. And so it is scary, but because so many people are used to looking at the past and then extrapolating and creating the new path in the future. But now we're like, no, we got to trust that the path is going to open up itself without any kind of historic past. You actually don't want to bring in the historic stuff because those systems are old, they're extractive, they're heavy, they're very masculine in nature. And not to say that the masculine is bad, like super structured, right? Very hierarchical, all that kind of stuff. Like everybody has a label, you know, like that's the logos, the male, the masculine is trying to identify and define. But the thing is, like, once you define something, then it already immediately in the definition limits itself. It limits that which it isn't really, right? And so once you define it, it limits. So now when we're talking about the feminine, and I know in the past podcasts you've talked about the feminine and the masculine, you know, we are moving toward, no, there is no definition, and yet the masculine will help create the shape for the feminine to actually be in. The only thing is we need to be flexible, and the flexibility is not in the system that we are in right now. And so more and more people are finding new ways to then create that flexibility, you know, whether it's in our work, the way we do our work, you know, so much of the remote working world and the digital nomad kind of, you know, space is really opening up. But again, it's happening pretty quickly because of all of the stuff that has been kind of moving us and ushering in this age, which is really an exciting time to be in if you see it from that lens, you know, and if you see it from a lens of there's still so many challenges, and again, focusing on the negative, you can focus on the negative so long as it's going to give you a contrast for the positive that you're going to be able to, that you want to bring into the world. But if you're focusing on the negative and then just like talking about it and just like spewing and projecting all the things that you want to have happen, but you're not doing anything to make it happen, then you're just kind of adding to the negativity, you know, and all that. Whereas if you're using that as an inspiration, and then the contrast really is working to move you in the direction of becoming the creator that we are and creating that which we want to see in the future. Right? Not what somebody else wants to see, but that we want to see. And I think that distinction is being made much more clearly now for many people.
You're so speaking my language. I love everything that you're saying, not just in terms of not focusing on the negative, but in terms of like, once we label and identify, then there are all the things that thing isn't. Like we've just taken infinite possibility and completely squelched it and like put on this really narrow path. And then the other piece that I really like is in terms of this regressive thinking, and this kind of like magical elevating of the past as though we need to go back to it. And I have this conversation with a lot of visionary thinkers who need to let, you know, it, just this kind of regressive, even the word revolution. And it's like, no, we never want to go backwards. We want to evolve, like take the R off of it. And it's not to say that there aren't bits and pieces from the past that can and will inform, but I love what you're saying in terms of like, yes, take what isn't working as a means of engineering what the up-leveled solution will be like use it as a tool so that we
Mhm.
can get into what we want and then focus on that, and then just this kind of feminine allowing of trusting that the more clear we are in the vision, the more we're able to kind of match the frequency of the solutions, then we'll have the support of these other forces that are far more intelligent than we as little like monkey brains in meat suits.
Yeah, I'm right now geeking out on Joseph Rael's book, Sound and Vibration.
Okay.
And it's really, if you're the type of person or anybody in the audience who's looking at how to work with inspiration and how to move into this new direction, and maybe some of your listeners already have that within themselves, but if you're able to like move with the frequency of an idea, right? So for me, ideas, thoughts, like all that stuff is frequency. We're all frequency, energy and all that good stuff. And so if you, what he shares with the public within the Tiwa language, he's actually a New Mexico native as well. Like his father's from the Picaris Pueblo.
Cool.
And I think he was born in either Colorado or California, but anyway, he ended up coming back here and learning in the Pueblos here. And the language, it already has the sound frequencies of what it actually means, or what it is. And he just describes it in such a beautiful way. And what he teaches you is like how to work with a frequency without controlling it, knowing, utilizing the cycle of nature and the way natural things progress. There is life, and then there's death, and there's everything in between. And just expecting that an idea will come to you because it's not your idea, it's an idea that you are inspired by, right? And so I have this belief also that like no idea is really original. It's just like we are antennas, and if you have like a very strong antenna, you could kind of plug into the collective and know what the heck the collective is thinking, like in terms of where we're all moving toward, and or where we're still sinking in, whichever one you want to think about. and so when you have this inspiration, it's like you sit with it and you get to like percolate and feel through it and be like, is this something that's going to excite me? Is this something that I want to do and create for myself because I want to see this in the future? Or is this something that I could just share with somebody verbally, and then they will pick it up and run with it, because it's not necessarily mine. I'm just the vehicle to which to inspire somebody else who's much more appropriate and much more passionate about it, and so then when you choose to bring something into form, then he freaking breaks down the whole process. It's amazing. Highly recommend. And he says also, like, again, this is words, so it's defining something that is indefinable, right? But that the way that they teach it in the Tiwa language is that there are 10 ways in which that idea comes into form, and then it dies, and shares that whole cycle. And for me, I'm learning that, again, even with a fire medicine, it's like, yeah, I don't need to work on it all the time, because universe, like that frequency, that idea will bring into my awareness whatever it needs to nourish it, right? It becomes its own energy as I put energy into it, right? And then it calls in other pieces that then I'm like, oh, that would be really good, or oh, this is the team that I need, and all that. And people start showing up in my life, or I'll start noticing, and probably you notice this too. You focus on something, and then all of a sudden, like, information arrives, right?
Totally.
And so it's that, like, in my Pechakucha talk, I talk about the vector. It's like, where are you pointing your vector, and putting that energy that you have into this idea. And then it also coalesces and brings into form how it wants to unfold. And that unfolding, if you allow it to unfold, it will unfold in the most graceful, effortless way. It's just that we have not been taught how to do that.
No.
Right. For the most part. there are some people who can do this beautifully, but for the most part, we have not been taught. And if anything, we have been taught to work really hard. And then we will have results, right? Like we reap the results of the labor that we put in. And there's a whole lot of literature out there on this. And I'm just like, no, thanks.
I always love talking to you. I haven't done it that many times, but you blow my mind. I'm really appreciative of because what you're speaking about to me is the return of the divine feminine. It's not like hippie girls wearing purple chiffon. It's like availing ourselves to a collaborative, interdependent relationship with cosmic forces and getting out of that hustle, do mindset. And it's refreshing to hear someone else talk about it, because a lot of times I feel like, am I the only one seeing this? But I'm also really appreciating, and I really, it's circuitous, so we'll come back to your own pathway. But what I'm struck by is your ability to unidentify, and how much freedom and magic there is when we're not identified. And I'm wondering if that's something that has always come naturally to you, if there was, something in your path that you kind of clued in to the process of unidentifying. What's your take on it?
That's a really good question. Part of it, I think, the first thing that comes to mind for me is I was a super rebellious child, super angsty. I did not want to be defined by my parents to become a doctor. They're both doctors. So forevermore, all of us were told to go and get a medical degree. And I was just like, I am not doing that. So there was a lot of knots and opposites. But again, when you're growing, I don't know if you have siblings, so for us, I wasn't really competitive, but my older two sisters were super competitive with one another. And then some of my younger siblings as well, but I never really was competitive, even though there is a super competitive side of me for myself. I am competitive with myself. My standards are really high, but right now I'm trying to ease that down, and be like, it doesn't need to be so high, Junko.
Right, good enough.
Yeah. And so I think because I had that training as a child, as an adult, there's so many preconceived notions of who I should be right? And I got a lot of reflection in the United States of who I ought to be, and then or how people perceive me. And then when I went back to Japan, same thing happened, right? So if I don't open my mouth and I just have all my makeup on and I dress like a Japanese person, conservative, then they just assume that I'm just your regular Japanese person. And so when if I'm being introduced to a male executive, they'll have a perception of who I am. And then the moment I open my mouth, then they're just like, oh shit, this person's not Japanese. And because I don't talk like a normal female Japanese person, and even my language, when I'm using Japanese, I'll use polite language, but I'm not going to become subordinate to the male language. In Japanese, there's so many different layers of the way that you speak, depending on your gender and depending on your rank. And so I can't get it all straight. So eventually, pretty fast, they'll know that I'm not a native Japanese speaker. and then they're just trying to wrap their head around, I could see, the brain crunching, I could feel it.
Dissonance, don't know what I'm dealing with.
And then they're just okay, but so I think because I've seen all that and experienced it for myself, I'm oh wow, yeah. So everybody has all these opinions about who I might be because through their own lens. And I know who I am. Although sometimes I could slip into how somebody else wants me to be because I'm just empathic that way. And often right now I'm getting to a point where I will catch myself doing that. Because I'm I don't need to make you feel comfortable and make myself feel small, and when you're I think when you start, like, when you realize that you're empathic and or sensitive. So your sensitivity, and I don't mean this in a, oh, you're sensitive, like the way that we sometimes understand sensitivity. We are actually leveling up in our sensitivity. So for folks who are actually experiencing this, it's going to be a little bit challenging. But if you think of sensitivity as actually a fine tuning of who you are, so that it's much more positive and an upgrade of you as a human vehicle, that you're enhancing your ability through this sensitivity, it completely changes your perspective on that word. So that's one. But when you become sensitive and you realize that you have the skill, it's nice to start watching yourself, how you interact with other people, especially women, because if you start interacting with other people, and even with other women who have issues and who have insecurities and all that kind of stuff, you might notice that then you become really gentle, but also insecure yourself, because you pick up the other person's energy. And because if you were to become strong and sovereign in your energy, the other person is going to be afraid. And so, and threatened. And we're so used to not threatening, not trying to be that person, right? Because we're called the bitch and all that. Right?
I can use more of that.
And so I was like, wow. And in Japan, we're supposed, it's just through osmosis that you become polite, And
like so the air you breathe in, it's just,
oh yeah, super constipated population emotionally, but and if you do it really well, you can still be graceful, but very strong in your presence. And I've seen women do this, and it's just amazing when I meet women, Japanese women who can carry this aspect of them. And even in the United States, I find that, there are certain women who can really carry that essence, being very polite and respectful, and yet still sitting completely in their sovereignty. It's freaking amazing energy. And so I think, when because I've been exposed to so many different versions of myself, so to speak, that allows me to be oh, okay, so I don't necessarily need to be in one area, but kind of like a Myers-Briggs or even the gene keys, right? It's a spectrum. You're very comfortable in this identity that, through your birth chart and all that kind of stuff, but that doesn't mean that you can't oscillate, across the whole spectrum. And at the end of the day, you want to come back into wholeness and into center and balanced. But that doesn't mean that you can't play along the range, of all of this.
Well, and I think that's the trap of identification, is that when we identify or attach to any of these aspects, then it becomes like a cage. I was talking to a girlfriend of mine over the weekend, and she had to move unexpectedly. She's in between, and she is I'm 6 planets in Capricorn and I'm in an empty house. And I was like, you're setting yourself up for failure. Just because you have 6 planets in Capricorn doesn't mean you don't have access to every other sign. So just pick the most flexible, fluid, go with the flow sign and call in those energies and those skill sets and play that way. But it's exactly what you said in the beginning. As soon as we identify, we cut ourselves off from all these other things. And it's just frustrating, watching other humans limit themselves, watching me do it when I get stuck in that trap. So I'm always just so inspired when I see other people who are in the practice of unidentifying.
Yeah, I think it could also be a little jarring if you don't have a discipline of coming back, to center, because, and I've gone into places where I'm like, yeah, that is not me. But I wanted to explore as as a soul and a human being to be guided by my soul to explore that aspect, and do that. But I think at the end of the day, it's if you explore too much and you're I say swimming in other pools too much, then you do start losing yourself, and you start giving away your power, because it's actually not who you are, and like when you say the unidentifying, it's at the end of the day, it's a balance, right? Like the masculine and the feminine needs to be in balance. The total non-identification of the female, or like the absolute exploration and the lava like energy
Right.
of life force, and all the creativity that comes with it. And then the masculine, which is more of the container, the direction, the focus, the definition. And without the two, you can't come into wholeness, and I think that's where we're like, the humanity, I find, is coming into wholeness, everyone coming at it from a different angle, different layer, all that. No one any less or more, but all sort of adding to the collective coming back into wholeness. And that's what I'm experiencing more and more, which is beautiful. And then I come back into my own body, and I'm like, okay, so what next? Like the reality of being in that moment, right?
Yeah, and being honest with how we're wired and what our predilections and preferences are. But I think, it is an internal, individualized alchemy. We talk about like, masculine and feminine coming into balance in the outer world. And it's like, well, that's only going to happen when we do that as individuals, and those shifts start to spread. And it's, I'll just speak for myself, being born and raised in this country, by a second wave feminist. For me, my path has been undoing a lot of those kind of like hyper masculine overlays, right? So for me, it's looking at like, okay, there are these tendencies and preferences. What happens when I remove the identification and allow myself to explore, and then, go really way out with that feminine exploration, and then come back to like, no, I'm actually wired for these preferences and these characteristics and these capabilities. But again, they're not me. And I think that's where I maintain my freedom as an ever evolving eternal being, is in acknowledging preferences, predilections, shadows, gifts, skill sets, whatnot, and adhering to them, but not confusing them with the larger capital M me, because then I have more space to improvise and shift in the moment.
Right. Yeah. There is a word, and I can't remember it, in Buddhism, that talks about like when you go into the all being, like all that is, and you feel that connectivity, that there is the integration and adjustment of then coming back into the singularity of who you are in this physical body, and that is a process. And I find that for me, that is my process, versus a lot of people who are ascending and going, like moving into that space of unity consciousness, and I'm just like, oh, been there, done that, don't need to do that. And I'm like, no, focusing on the here and now and getting grounded, and and finding my preferences, rather than being plugged into the collective, and recognizing what the need is, and feeling like I am responsible to deliver that need, which has been pretty much my entire childhood. And so, extricating myself out of that, and then bumping into the whole like collective, and being like, oh, wow, okay, yeah. And then being like, no, but I'm trying to get like back into me, and all the things that I love, and like what Junko wants, this body wants.
Yeah. It reminds me of what I see a lot of like in the psychedelic community, in terms of like going really far out and blasting big ceremonies. And it's like, well, that's lovely, but like, how are you integrating it, and how are you bringing that into your day to day? Because some aspect of us agreed to play this game of like third dimensional limitations. So as much as it's lovely to like, geek out in those realms, for me, the task is like, okay, well, how is that going to serve me in this incarnation and what I signed up for here?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. I haven't really explored the psychedelic in person. Like I don't feel like I need to vibe or smoke or whatever, you know, the physical particles, like I could just tap into it, whatever. But I find that, you know, not only is it like, how are you integrating it, but it's like, when do you stop swimming in the psychedelic, right?
Totally.
Which I find that a lot of folks swim in it because they're like, I need that hit again. I need that hit. It's almost like an addictive tendency of this experience, this feeling. And then, you know, so one of the things that's coming up actually is during COVID, I was listening to a podcast, and I'm sorry, I can't remember exactly which one it was. And the lady was talking about you know, people who had to go back, you know, into their home and do work from home, like they were starting to get stir crazy, but also they're like, there's something that I'm missing that I got when I was in the workforce, like when I actually went to work, you know. And so what she said, you know, she was just like, well, what is the essence of that experience? You know, and then identify what that essence is, and is that something that then you can create for yourself in your current environment, you know, because it's not like you're completely cut off from humanity. You could still, you know, with a mask or whatever, or over Zoom, create that very same essence. But what is that, you know? And I find that with folks who are going into psychedelics, or that sense of seeking an experience, or maybe an escapism from their day-to-day, you know, because it creates a very different, like out of this world kind of experience if that's not your norm. And then it's like, but what's the essence? What are you actually going after? And if you could find that piece, then it's like, then you could start really doing the integration much faster, I find, because there's, it's addictive for a reason, you know, like you still haven't labeled it in your head, right? Logos hasn't kicked in. So you haven't been able to articulate what the experience means for you. But once you are able to articulate it, then you could say, okay, this is something that I could actually gain through another experience that is less stressful on my body and doesn't kick in the addictive tendency.
Yeah.
Right. Which again, you, in a way, it's like you're giving away your power because you're externalizing something that is actually within you. Right. And then start working on, how do I bring this into myself? That's one way of kind of like looking at it. The other way of looking at it is a colleague of mine. He started DMT Quest. And it's a project that basically is fundraising for research that is out like at University of Michigan, or was it UC Berkeley, you know, where they're doing a lot of psychedelic research, but not so much psychedelics as it is the endogenous DMT, like the DMT that's already in your body, the chemicals that are already in our body, that our bodies are producing naturally, and working with that element to then go into a space of unity consciousness, equanimity, whatever, like harmony, whatever it is, but putting money into research that is going to help us do that on our own without the reliance of these ceremonies. And, you know, sometimes I find that these ceremonies are actually not done with integrity, actually many. And so, and the approach to which you do it, because it's you, I think teaches someone how to be more respectful of the body of who you are, you know. And ultimately, I'm hoping that more and more folks start realizing, oh, this is within me. It's not something that I need to go and like, you know, inject myself or drink this, that, and the other, or even alcoholism, right? Like alcohol does the same thing. And so it's like, how do we reach that sense of oneness and wholeness without extrapolating too much?
I really like that. Yeah. I also, because it's just like, I feel like a big part of the kind of social control going on is that people are always reaching outside of themselves for authority, permission, validation, a high, whatever it is. So I love the prompt to just invite us to go within. We all have DMT in our brains all the time. So I love this project. And I also think, in terms of distraction, addiction, dopamine, there's also the social currency and the kind of egoic hits that come with like bragging about however many ceremonies you did or however many
Oh
combo
Lord,
burns.
really? Oh
Oh,
my
I mean,
gosh.
I've seen it so much, but I don't really
Okay.
see, like no one's bragging about like, well, I just sobbed in the fetal position with my 4-year-old inner child, like that doesn't get the same kind of egoic currency that I think psychedelics get. And then I also get really concerned about the control mechanisms coming in through the psychedelics now that they're being decriminalized, regulated,
Mm.
pushed by some questionable organizations and entities. But I'm very intrigued by your own ability to connect with these states, spirits, if it's like neurological pathways, whatever, without the substances themselves. And I'm wondering, like, A, why that is. Does it relate to your connection with these light languages? Like, why are you a
Mhm.
mystical superhero?
That's a new label.
You can have it if
I
it
love it. I
resonates.
love it. I think it's because my sensitivity is pretty robust, and it
Always
goes.
been robust, or did you develop it?
I developed it, or I became more conscious of it. I think
Mhm.
I've always been impacted. So like I could like I did so I do hypnotherapy on myself, and I've been trained in the Mercer style of hypnotherapy as well. But I took myself back into like my mother's womb, and I could feel myself in her womb in a fetal state, and the memories and the emotions that she was going through. And so I think we all have that. It's just a matter of how aware can you become in that sensitivity? How open will you be able to come without all the protective mechanisms that you probably have as a human being? And some people like that's their job, is to show how like different stages of the human beingness, and for me it's this super sensitivity, and I didn't really understand it until probably 2017, when I went into a what was it, 2017, somewhere around there. I went into a cave in Romania, and it
Oh, is
was
this
one of
the
those.
salt cave where the cathedral is? Because I haven't been able to get that out of my mind.
I have not been there, but it
Okay.
was nearby.
Okay.
And it's one of those caves where, so Romania has all these, they still practice the Orthodox Catholic Christian traditions. And it's a very spiritual country still. And they have these monasteries that, where monks go and meditate, or just like people just go and meditate for years or weeks or however long, and over generations. And one of the oldest caves was this, like, there's a Christian little, I mean, it literally is, you're walking into the earth. And it's like the moment I walked in, time stopped. Like it was almost like I was in a different dimension. And there was a cross and like, all these effigies of Christ and all that. And when I walked out of it, like I just started bursting into tears, and I could not stop at all. Like, and I'm, I'm Japanese, we don't show emotion, like definitely not in public. And even if you're on your own, like you don't go there, and I was like full on, like crying, like nose snotty, all this stuff, like good 20 minutes solid. So after that, I was like, oh
Were there any
shit.
stories, or was it just pure
No,
emotion?
pure emotion, just uncontrollable. And when that happened, I was like, I need to figure out what this is all about, and it just so happened that a friend of mine had invited me to go do like some kind of energy training. And at the time, like, I was just like, I don't know what this is, but I'm just going to do it, because it was just something about energy. And I was like, yes. And
Was there an aspect of you that was
yeah.
conflicted around that? Because you're like, I'm a practical poli-sci person? Or was it you?
No, there wasn't I think when you viscerally experience something, it just eliminates any
Got it.
questions.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that's the thing, like even with psychedelics, it's like you viscerally experience it. And once you experience it, you can't not experience it.